It's always a great pleasure to meet in the summer school. Although for the last 2 years we have not been able to meet in person, but I'm happy that we managed to keep together people in the summer school, and hopefully our next summer school will be in person. Today is a special occasion, which for the last 5 years we have been opening the summer school with some Moyo Memorial Lecture in celebrating the life of our brother and comrade Sam Moyo. And for this fifth Sam Moyo lecture, a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Yao Graham, who I'm sure many of you may know. Yao, I hesitate to describe it as an activist because Yao has been more than an activist. He has been a prominent political person on the left in Ghana, and I dare say in Africa for a very long time. And if my memory serves me right, his activities were very strong during Rawlings I, which earned him a kind of semi-exile, during which time he did his PhD at Warwick. And I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Yao Graham at Warwick as external supervisor. Since then, we have stayed in touch, and he has been invited him to various workshops of our Land Rights Research Institute, Akiardi, and also to Mwalimu Nyerere Chair in Pan-African Studies. In the summer school and our Agrarian South Network, we have been talking a lot about the agrarian question, central to which, of course, is the land question. Now, land is, of course, more than the surface. Land includes the underground resources, among which minerals, of course, is most important. And Yao today is going to talk about minerals, on which he has been researching and talking for quite long as part of his Third World network. So we are adding a new dimension, which I hope we'll continue discussing, because mineral has been, as you know, central to Africa becoming a battleground. During the first Cold War, it was the minerals which led to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and to the plight of the Congo, the quagmire from which Congo has still to emerge. And again, as we're witnessing, minerals is again likely to be a central issue over which the so-called Second Cold War may also be waged on the African continent. So I'm very glad and happy that we have now opened this new chapter, or so to speak, in discussing the whole question of minerals in our summer school, and continue to study and understand in all its dimensions how the resources of Africa have been pillaged, and how the resources of Africa can, on the other hand, become an important launching pad for the development of the continent. With those few words, I have great pleasure in inviting and presenting to you Dr. Yao Graham to deliver the fifth Sam Moyo lecture. Yao will speak for about 45 to 60 minutes, and after that we'll have Q&A and CNR, comments and reflections. So Yao, welcome, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa. And let me express my gratitude to the Sam Moyo Institute for African Institute for Agrarian Studies for the privilege of being invited to deliver the 5th Sam Moyo Memorial Lecture as part of the 2022 Summer School of SMICE and the Agrarian South Network. This year's Summer School is under the theme Pathways to a Just Transition, Ecology and Popular Movements in the South. Sam was an outstanding intellectual, a comrade and friend whose death was a tragic loss to Zimbabwean, African, and global South progressive scholarship and activism. The topic of my lecture, Minerals and Africa's Development, Struggles over Discourses, Policies and Practices, connects quite well with the theme of this year's school. Isa made some important points about the fact that land issues are not simply about the surface, but also involves the subsoil. And of course, that is the increasingly, even mining, of course, includes also the surface minerals and so on. So I'm glad to be able to make a contribution to the meeting. And the connection between my presentation and the theme of the school is very simple. I mean, Africa's political economy has been shaped by raw material commodity export dependence since colonialism. And the transformation of this reality has been a defining and continuing issue since independence. Central to that raw material commodity export dependence, of course, is an unsustainable resource intensity of growth, where Africa's natural capital is depleted for an inequitable exchange with big, but the more developed economies, whilst the continent is left with the environmental burden of such extraction, and of course the social and environmental externalities which leave the lives of people in the near neighborhood of the mines devastated. My talk looks at the evolution of the struggles for the control benefits of the mineral economy and the transformation of this raw material commodity export economies. The focus is on the period since the commodity boom of the early 2000s, which saw a transformation involving the entrance of new actors into the African economy as part of some major shifts also in the global economy, particularly the rise of China and also key global South countries like India and Brazil and so on. In talking about Africa, of course, there's always the danger of essentializing a complex reality of more than 50 countries. But in the area of mineral policy and raw material commodity export dependence, decentralization does not misrepresent, because there are many commonalities, if only because colonialism had the same project in terms of extraction when it fragmented the African continent. There are many commonalities with the rest of the global South, but this talk is focused very much on the African experience, because again, the whole global South has been subordinated to the accumulation and profit logic of global capital. And again, just one last caveat, a lot of the material I use is from sub-Saharan Africa, partly because the access to information on North Africa is a bit more difficult in this area. Although again, I'll make some references as and when necessary. Now, if I can just share my screen for a start. Thank you. Yeah. I start from the very beginning of the post-colonial efforts at transformation, because as I said, the political economy of the continent has been shaped by raw material commodity export dependence. And all African countries were left with this legacy. of being basically raw material exporters. So there's a common challenge that all countries faced, because the whole project of independence also was animated by a vision of transformation, a vision of transformation driven by a modernization paradigm, and therefore, which also carried the legitimacy of the popular struggles that led to independence. Basically, the challenge was, how do you transform a raw material commodity export dependent economy and society into a modern industrial economy and society? And independence was seen as a key opportunity for initiating this transformation. Gaining control of mineral resources was seen as part of this, and also, of course, the policy space to implement choices. There's the reality to the economic vulnerability from volatilities. In that period, there was not much interest or attention to the issues of environmental impacts of mining, and sustainability in a certain sense was narrowly defined as building integrated economies that benefited people in society. And the push in that period benefited also from the wider alliances of the non-aligned movement, the Global South. Key steps included taking domestic control of minerals, public ownership of minerals, nationalization, and so on, and schemes for mineral-based industrialization, indigenization of skilled workers, and also of subsectors. In the international arena, African countries were part of the push by ex-colonial countries for new norms on permanent sovereignty over minerals, economic rights and duties of states, the right to choose economic systems, the right to development, for new international economic order, and also schemes for managing international commodity trade through stabilization schemes and producer groups, which allowed producers to kind of catalyze their power. And the OPEC is one of the survivors of this. And of course, the creation of UNCTAD in 1964 itself was part of that global effort to have a dedicated UN agency that would focus on the issues of trade and development as it affected developing countries. And the commodities issue was at the center of UNCTAD's mandate. It's a sign of the times that UNCTAD's role as part of the shift in global power has shrunk to the point where its very survival is at stake. And I think, furthermore, in the context of that time, from the very beginning, a pan-African perspective and vision has always been part of how African countries have strategized about how to proceed. And popular struggles have also always taken the pan-African perspective as a given. These are just references to some of the charters and so on. Now, we know that the efforts of the immediate post-colonial period, though celebrated, actually led to very mixed results. Mixed results in the sense that the nationalizations did not significantly affect the control of the dominant Western TNCs in African economies. The rent share that went to African economies, we could say, was substantially improved, but the decision-making about production and marketing, remained essentially in the hands of these firms. There was an early lesson also in the fact that, as lawyers would say, ownership doesn't give you everything. Possession, as they say, is 9/10 of the law. And through the possession and control that they had, public ownership of the minerals and the nationalizations were gutted of a lot of possibilities, which is not to say nothing was gained, because in some countries, it allowed the initiation of an integrated approach to the mineral economy. So in a country like Zambia, where Zambia has the largest smelting and refining capacity among one of the largest among copper producing countries, there's also a plan for local procurement, backward and forward linkages, between the mining sector and so on. But the context, all this came crashing down because of the global economic crisis that engulfed the world in that period. and commodity price declines were a very key part of it. When the story is told about African mismanagement, African corruption as a key factor for the economic crisis, we know about debt. But one of the things which tends to be understated is just the savage impact of the decline in the terms of trade, which the World Bank, for example, noted that the cumulative losses between 1970 and 1997 represented almost 120% of Africa's GDP, a massive and persistent drain of purchasing power. So, of course, with the terms of trade crisis, volatility of mineral prices was a very central part of it. And if you look at this graph about mineral prices, you can see that from the mid-70s onwards, we had a very, very, very poor period, which is captured in the quote that I've just given you from the World Bank. We know that it was into this context that structural adjustment policies were initiated. And in mineral producing countries, the revival, or what I call the restoration of the commodity export economy, was deemed a central part of the structural adjustment project. In mineral exporting countries, the restoration of the mineral economy and also the reversal of nationalization of enterprises was a very key part of the project. There are two quotes that I have here from the World Bank, which of course drove the transition. The World Bank basically made clear, and the area highlighted in red makes that point clear, that the primary objective of mineral policy in Africa going forward should be about maximizing tax revenues rather than pursuing other economic or political objectives such as control of resources or employment. And they saw their role as a main objective as facilitating the private investor to help reduce the country and project-related costs for the investors. These quotes are taken from the World Bank's Strategy for African Mining, which was published in 1992. By which time, of course, a lot of things had already started happening. And in the period, in the decade or so after Ghana now started privatizing its mineral sector, more than 30 countries have passed liberalizing legislation following the Ghanaian path. These things involve critically state withdrawal from production and privatization of mining state-owned enterprises at giveaway prices, and an emphasis on creating an enabling environment for attracting foreign investment into the mining sector. So institutions and laws supportive for FDI-based export-led mineral development strategy were put in place. And the tax exemptions, basically creating the fiscal and other conditions for profitability of firms was kind of kicked in. And I think the fiscal measures were very key. And also a restoration of the focus on developing minerals of export value. This is very key because really when you look at the mining boom in Africa today, one of the striking things about it is how, if you go to most African countries, they have data right to maybe even the previous day on how, the value or the volume of minerals being exported out of the country, but they are not developing databases on minerals being produced and consumed, in the country. And these tend to be left to small scale miners. Of course, outside South Africa, which and also northern, some of the economies in northern Africa, this is South Africa, of course. The mineral, the energy mining complex it's an integral part of the apartheid legacy, and the domestic use of minerals is also part of the economic setup. And the key concern of this model, of course, was the revenue stream, as the quotes that I've read to you from the World Bank kind of highlighted. Well, we could say that on its own terms, as we know, the policy has been successful, But there are a number of consequences. There's an increased inflow of foreign capital into the production of minerals. Some of the minerals that benefited particularly were gold and copper. Privatization of the mining parastatals led to massive layoff of workers. For example, in Zambia, 40,000 workers were laid off by the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, and the boom also led to an increased dispossession of agrarian producers and communities and a disruption of their livelihoods through de facto state expropriation. Why do I say de facto state expropriation? Because in almost all African countries, the legal, shall we say, sleight of hand is for the government to say simply giving a concession to the mining company in regard to the subsoil. And that is for the company to negotiate the compensation and other arrangements in respect of the top soil with the people sitting on the land. But given the legal situation that the state's eminent domain over the subsoil and minerals has primacy over other claims to land use, it means basically that once that eminent domain is exercised, I mean, whatever other rights exist in the land, are superseded. But implied in this also is a certain reflexive assumption that mining has a superiority over other land use choices. And this land use choice, of course, it's a major issue of conflict. And you find that, for example, in a place like Ghana, there are 106 large-scale mines involved mainly in gold. Concessions have been given up, covering 4,500 kilometers. This is more than 1 million acres, and is in prime forested agricultural area. So a lot of cocoa farms, oil palms, food farms have gone under as a result of this expansion of mining. In Burkina Faso, for example, ASM, large-scale mining exploded in the past 15 years. They've gone from having none to having 12 new large-scale mines. So, and as I said, this thing led us also, because of this expropriation and dispossession, conflicts of various intensities have increased. And the state has generally tended to intervene on the side of the mines. In Ghana today, all the large-scale mines have an agreement with the Ghanaian military to protect their mines. It raises the question about, what the role of a national army is and what domestic policing is about. There has been a revival of and growth of export mineral production. And because of the type of capital which is dominant, because mining capital has become increasingly financialized. And as I'll come back to discuss in another context in this presentation, the search for shareholder value has also had a certain impact on labor relations. In the context of outsourcing or what are deemed to be non-core areas of the mining enterprise, and there's an increasing casualization, in mines, and which has had pretty terrible consequences. We know about Marikana, but there have been incidents in other cases. For example, in Ghana, 2 years ago, the bauxite mine, was thrashed by the workers, and a lot of the facility was burnt because people found that their wages basically went down to a third of what they used to enjoy once casualization took place. We've also had a reinvigoration of colonial style enclave mining, very weak regulatory regimes. And in the countryside, we have a situation where the state retreat has led to mining firms now taking responsibility through corporate social responsibility initiatives for rural development. At the intra-African level, countries have been engaged in competition, for FDI, which has also involved basically intensifying the giveaway of incentives and also giving away policy space. Now, this disruptive and dispossessing model needed to be kept in place. I mean, every regime, of course, needs to build legitimacy. And we know that the main claim has been that FDI will deliver development. FDI in mining would deliver jobs, transformation, revenue, and so on and so forth. Now, what we have had from very early on is that the international financial institutions and the capital exporting countries have taken steps to reinforce, in alliance with international NGOs, the legitimacy of the FDI for rent regime. And I just want to highlight a number of elements which on their own can be justified, but which taken together, in my view, represent really frameworks of legitimation, based around traditional representations of African, weakness, because they are concerned with the things which pathologize the African condition, the so-called resource scarce, where African tenders into conflict, to corruption, and mismanagement, and so on. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the Kimberley process, and the Natural Resource Charter have been described as externally imposed regimes of restraint. But these have been key to reinforcing the legitimacy of the model created by the World Bank-led FDI for rent setup. How does it work? Because these are all initiatives that have been designed from outside the continent. They claim to be international, but actually they are not, because only a small fraction of countries are involved in it. They tend to be voluntary. They are kind of unilateral. They've initiated in many cases by small group of private actors with the support of big powers and institutions. And they have a view of minerals and development, which is represented in this image that I've picked from a World Bank book on the extractive value chain. You find here that basically it emphasizes the taxes as a central benefit of the mineral economy, and it has set up the EITI as a kind of mechanism. This is a World Bank document which has inserted the EITI as a key instrument in terms of governance of the mining sector. And 50 African countries make up the majority of the 55 members of the EITI. 27 out of 55 are members of out of the 55 member countries are African countries. And the EITI is backed by the major powers. The World Bank manages a trust fund and provides technical support, which then is distributed to participating countries to help them set up the mechanisms and so on. And it is both its use of soft power, but also has been a source of pressure. So you find that it is, particularly when countries have come out of war and so on, they end up joining the EITI. And its focus on transparency underlines the primacy also given to revenue. Interestingly, environmental and social impacts is not one of the issues that is of interest to the EITI. And the biggest international network of CSOs working on extractives, the Publish What You Pay network, working on the EITI is a central part of their concern. So at the national level, you have this tripartite arrangement, of companies, interested CSOs, and government as the governing mechanism of the EITI, and they report within a kind of global accountability system. This is not a multilateral framework. This is a unilateral framework which the World Bank and the key donor countries superintend, and it's a very key legitimating point. I think one of its effects is to give the impression that so long as companies are paying their taxes, it really, if there are failures of the model, it is because governments are not properly utilizing the revenue which is accruing to them. The Natural Resource Charter, which is the centerpiece of the work of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, basically is a version of this. The Natural Resource Charter is a product was initiated by Paul Collier, who I think many of you know about. Paul Collier definitely has a pathological view of African development, an African tendency to conflict, corruption, and mismanagement. And if you look at the early versions of the Natural Resource Charter framework, there's some very ideological things, including hostility to public, to state-owned enterprises and so on. But it's all been cleaned up, as the thing has evolved. And you find that African countries pay quite a lot of attention to their relationship with these frameworks compared to paying attention to the accountability to their citizens. They report regularly, but it's quite difficult for parliaments, for example, to get accountability from parliament. This is why I characterize these things as representing a mechanism of legitimation for the model. Now, the current phase of this model that I've described and this legitimating frameworks, of course, are products of structural adjustment. At the time that they were being set up, I don't think the TNCs were expecting anybody apart from themselves to be the beneficiaries of that framework. But we know that the commodity boom has been very much driven by both demand from emerging global south economies and also investment from those countries. Now, the commodity boom has intensified international and African domestic struggles about control, access, and benefits from mining. And you will find that as time has passed, over the past 20 or so years, we've seen an overlap and confluence of popular pressures and elite disappointment with economic returns from the model that they championed. Now, this just a few stylized facts about the boom. Demand from outside the G8 and also investment from outside the G7 has been very important. It's led to a frenzied expansion in production and increased displacement and conflict. There are new African countries which are now kind of very dependent on extractives. To that sense, the boom has intensified Africa's raw material commodity export dependence and unsustainable extraction of natural capital. And whilst public revenues have increased, governments have been largely disappointed about inequities in benefit sharing. It's also because of the impacts led to a heightened citizens' mobilization and protests against negative impacts, poor development returns, growing socioeconomic inequalities, weak official accountability, and corruption. And there's been an expansion of artisanal and small-scale mining across the continent as people who were excluded from the benefits of large-scale mining sought to also gain a foothold. So in Ghana, for example, as of 2018, from being barely 10% of gold production 15 years earlier, artisanal and small-scale miners were producing 43% of Ghana's gold. The frenzy of kind of increasing returns also has led to increased outsourcing in large-scale mines and casualization of work and widening of income inequalities. This diagram here just shows you the ways in which the mineral prices, have moved since that period. Over the period, in a way, it's a take on what the earlier thing I showed you. You see that from about the 2000, there's been a very sharp rise, in commodity prices. This is another representation of it, using the price of gold, copper, platinum, and aluminum to make the point. You see the very sharp rise that occurred from around 2000 and so on. And you also see how the boom recovered very quickly from the sharp dip when the global economic crisis took place. I selected these minerals because these are minerals of importance for African economies, but they give you a picture. Now, the China entrance into the story China, India, and so on. It's very important. And I think it's important to insert this in the discussion, both to demystify and also to underline some of the struggles that have erupted. Now, this is Chinese consumption. This is an indication of China's share of global consumption, the way it grew between 2000 and 2007. The growth in Chinese consumption should not be confused with the growth in Chinese mining investment outside China and in Africa, because a lot of course, there's a lot of importation from all over the world. The Chinese appetite definitely was a major driver of the boom. And alongside also came the Chinese interest in investing in Africa. This is a pie chart which gives you an idea about the distribution of Chinese investment in Africa as of 2015. Mining made up 28% of that, of the investment. This compares, interestingly, with the US FDI in Africa in that same way, where it's mining made up 66% of investment. You wouldn't know it from the China bashing that takes place in the discussions of mining investment, in Africa. This gives you, this is a graph of China's share of global mining in terms of investment, Chinese controlled investment outside China, and as of 2018, and it's just about 3.5%. This table gives an idea about Chinese controlled production in Africa as of 2018. And of course, you can see the areas which bauxite, Chinese controlled production is very substantial. Copper, it's very important. Uranium, cobalt, and so on. But what this tells you also is that in the copper, cobalt producing countries, Chinese influence is very big. If you take the manganese, for example, whilst it's 3%, in Gabon, Chinese control of the only manganese mine means that it's very significant. This is quite separate from how much China imports from across Africa. But this is just to give you an idea about the Chinese growth, which in terms of investment. This is also does not include the small scale miners who tend to be present in gold and kind of some of the more precious minerals. The cobalt case in the DRC also includes the purchases by Chinese firms from small scale cobalt miners in the DRC. This chart gives you a breakdown of who controls copper, which is an important mineral, which is becoming even more important in the renewable energy sector. You can see China has a substantial presence in the, but you can also see that the Canadian company First Quantum alone, has a very substantial presence. Between Glencore, Barrick, and Quantum, the bulk of Africa's copper export, is controlled. Now, the profits and so on, the boom also exposed the limits and the fault lines of the FDI for revenue model. So if we take a look at what happened to the gains of the companies between 2002 and 2006, the average net profit of the biggest mining firms increased by more than 1,400%. Okay, and I've just got some more detail about the revenue and so on. And this is a graph of how net profits and also profits went out over the period from 2002 of the biggest mining firms. And even the global crisis isn't dampen that, because in 2010, it turned out the 2008-2009 crisis was a mere blip, in the benefits that the companies were getting. This is a representation of the way in which extractive industry shares suddenly kind of zoomed up, as it were, during the global boom in terms of compared to other equities in the Fortune Global 500 list of companies. Now, on the African side, serious inequities, and I think Zambia, which many of you probably know, has been at the center of a lot of controversies with mining companies. It's a good example because, I mean, the price of copper went up quadrupled really between 2004 and 2008. And if you look at the profits made by the firms controlling the Zambian mines, I mean, First Quantum's profits, for example, rose from 4.6 million in 2003 to 152 million, almost 153 million in 2008. By contrast, Zambia earned only $10 million from royalties because it had the lowest royalty rate in the world. Remember what I said earlier about the royalty rate? Zambia, in privatizing its mines, agreed a royalty rate of 0.6% for its mines, which was way below the average of 3% royalty which prevailed across the continent. Even those rates were very poor. And this is a quote which points to how suddenly in the official institutions, people were scratching their heads about how this mining boom was not contributing to the company's, to the continent's growth. And increasingly, you began to hear official expressions of dissatisfaction. Now, these, but the other things which also came out was that beyond the inequities in domestic revenue sharing, the channels for outflows from Africa also intensified the inequities. So UNCTAD did a number of studies which pointed to the fact that, I mean, basically the wide open capital accounts where people could, repatriate their profits, import and export whatever they like, led to also supported illicit financial flows. And basically, even where they were not illicit, generous resource flows out of the country. So the percentage of mineral values that remained in the economies, even from a revenue perspective, was pretty minuscule. Never mind the fact that since the revenue was the focus, other economic activities that were possible were not getting any attention. Paradoxically, the much lamented artisanal and small-scale mining sector, which is the largest employment sector in mining across Africa, also happens to be the sector where value is a better facilitator of accumulation because the operators tend to be domestic operators who invest in their local communities and so on. And also, of course, there's the whole thing about, a comparative thing about the kind of the negative impacts and externalities, but that's a different discussion. Now, you could see that this situation I've described, the dispossession, the casualization, the failed promise, and so on, led to, had a number of consequences. What I call generated the reform agenda seed, the seeds of a reform agenda. From kind of popular constituencies, there was basically, the fact that public ownership has been, throughout this period, de facto elite ownership and kind of to manage in an authoritarian way without accountability became a factor, particularly when citizens who are meant to be co-owners, the kind of the actual owners of the resource for whom the minerals are being held in trust, are being kicked off their lands and livelihoods are being disrupted in the countryside. Jobs are not guaranteed or are poor quality in the mines, inequalities in how the benefits are being shared, even the revenue is being utilized and so on. The human rights abuses, ASM being marginalized and not being treated well. I mean, all these things generated, pressures from below. From a state, from an elite side, of course, suddenly there's an interest in better reform of the relationship with mining capital, so as to increase the economic benefits. It took the form of various forms. And then there's also the concern for increased economic benefits beyond revenue. And this is where you found the ways in which adaptation and cooptation to retain hegemony by capital, and also the role played by institutions like the World Bank kick in. Because once the pressure for local content began to increase, the World Bank was no longer simply a champion of revenue, but was ready to consider reform of the revenue regimes. Then the IMF and World Bank were in agreement, and the donors to adjust the pressure on the inequities from the fiscal returns, and also ready to consider new frontiers in terms of local content. And of course, the issue of structural economic transformation and ending community dependence was put back on the agenda, because when the brief crash took place in 2008, 2009, even the much celebrated Botswana model came into crisis. Botswana had to go and get the biggest ever loan given out by the AFDB, to help it manage its balance of payments crisis. It borrowed 1.5 billion from the AFDB because diamond prices crashed, in that period. So the structural dependence issue was back very much in the frame. And I've just indicated the elements of this of the popular demand. I mean, the place like South Africa, there were issues around nationalization, the Black economic empowerment debates, and so on. And all these things were helped by the fact that, there's quite a different international climate and domestic climate compared to the early post-colonial period, when it was a broad nationalist agenda led by largely authoritarian regimes, which came to grief, with the global crisis from the early 1970s. Here, I think, despite the authoritarianism, there's a lot more domestic political space. New issues and social movements have arisen domestically across the region and in Africa and globally around environmental standards. There are international frameworks and levers for making demands. The ILO's free, prior, informed consent framework, it's something which has gained foothold among African activists. And also the African Commission for Human and People's Rights gave an option outside the domestic space for people to raise issues. And of course, international solidarity and lessons and international arena provided an opportunity also for popular mobilization and organization to build support and to strengthen its case. So I just thought this insertion of the South African specific is important, because South Africa, its gross inequalities also coexist with the fact that it's a fairly developed mineral economy with a value addition sector and backward linkages and so on. But within that, of course, the post-apartheid regime contained specific issues about changing labor regimes, the legacy and effects of migrant labor regimes, contradictions within the anti-apartheid alliance, the immigration and internationalization of South African capital, which had particular effects on South African enterprises because they became subject to the pressures of financialized capital in the same way like anybody else, which was quite different from the kind of more conservative long-term approach, of your classic mining firm. And then of course there's the legacy issues, in South Africa. And organizational expressions, as I said, have also improved. But I think a point worth noting here is how in quite a few African countries, traditional leaders have begun to push subnational demands for control, mobilizing ethnic and similar sentiments. It's not only the Royal Bafokeng Trust. Some in South Africa, it does nothing like that exist in other places. But chiefs, as part of an elite accommodation, have increasingly gained voice. I mean, what would have been outrageous some time ago is quite easily said without any fear of being excoriated. So not too long ago, the Asantehene in Ghana actually made a demand that henceforth traditional leaders should co-sign mineral concessions alongside, with the government. I mean, this raises questions about what public ownership, a common vesting, in citizens. Put aside even the question of abuse, where that is represented. But I think it points to the fact a dimension of the dissatisfaction with the regime and its impacts and legacies, and also some of the intra-elite struggles about who should be a pole, for benefit. What we have seen in the period, and these are the elements which I would describe as beginning to point to a kind of an African discourse which seeks both the reform of the hegemonic rent-based, FDI rent-based model, as well as making demands which go beyond beyond that model to basically challenging the kind of the neoliberal framework and subordination of commodity export-dependent African countries. So a number of common elements have emerged at the national level, policies around fiscal measures, which include review of contracts and changing royalty rates and so on. And challenging illicit financial flows going out. I think the most dramatic example was when the long-running saga that the Tanzanian government was involved with Barrick over its subsidiary Acacia mining company, which eventually Barrick settled for $300 million. In Zimbabwe, indigenization has been a key part of the push there, also linked critically with very specific domestic factors around the land reform and the country's isolation and so on. But it's also an example which points to the fact that, we cannot presume the benefits would accrue, to the citizens who are presumed to be the owners of the resource. There's been a wave of local content policies across the continent, which would allow more domestic actors to benefit from the mineral economy beyond revenue accruing to the state. I'll come back to local content policies and its challenges and limitations presently. There are some new developments also which are connected again with the future of energy minerals, which I think we need to pay attention to. So the DRC government at the COP26 climate change talks announced that henceforth it would insist that Glencore process cobalt in the DRC. And there are publications talking about how it will be much cheaper to produce the material for batteries in the DRC than to export the raw material. And across the continent, there have been measures either to improve the status of ASM or to suppress it. And there have been a number of interesting developments by non-executive African agencies, I call them state institutions. In South Africa, for example, there's a decision in the Holobeni case, which basically said community consent is required for mining projects to go on. The African Center for Human and People's Rights has passed a number of resolutions supporting popular demands on human rights and accountability, and also upholding the right to free, prior, informed consent by mining affected communities. There have been a number of regional initiatives in SADC and ECOWAS, which incorporate some of the popular demands, particularly the ECOWAS framework. SADC has put out a regional mining vision, which takes off from the African mining vision to try and concretize it as a regional development framework. The African Union has put out the Agenda 2063, which has structural adjustment, structural transformation, at its pillar. and it covers a whole range of interlinked things: minerals, climate change, democracy, and so on and so forth. But I think the most significant of these frameworks, of course, has been the Africa Mining Vision, which was first adopted as a vision in 2009, and then in 2011, there was an action plan developed for it, and then in 2014, a country mining vision framework was developed, and then the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries have also developed a minerals and development framework, which is very much cloned from the African mining vision. Now, the African mining vision, which I would focus on, I make the argument that if you look at the MV, it synthesizes a number of the key demands which have come from popular struggles, as well as the demands and expectations, of government. And I think that synthesis itself reflects the pressures that governments have felt from their population. I mean, in 2008, I was surprised to discover I was invited to speak at the African Union ministers meeting of mining ministers, in the senior officials meeting, to give a kind of a keynote presentation. And I was kind of dazed, literally, by the fact that whilst I was being denounced in Ghana as a subversive for asking for accountability for foreign capital, there were people interested to hear what people like us had to say. And the mood in that meeting was very, 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 very curious, because after the presentation, the meeting had scheduled a session with the heads of mining TNCs in Africa. But the mood in the room became so riotous after the discussions following my presentation that the meeting with the TNC chief executives had to be cancelled, because people said, what are these characters doing here? They're destroying our continent, blah, blah, blah. But people were just feeling the pressure, and also their own sense, that they have been had the faith in these things were done. The African mining vision combines a number of things. What you find is that it has a vision about, basically has a vision of structural transformation based around linkages and economy, and also has a thing about sustainability, and also the use of rents, inclusiveness. Also has a thing about artisanal and small-scale miners and their role, in local economies, and integrated rural development, and also improved governance, health and safety, and so on and so forth, and local enterprise development, relations between state and society and private sector, and all those things were set up in the action plan. Now, this is, if you compare this to the FDI-based model introduced by the bank, this goes quite some way. And basically, it's an effective, rejection of that framework. Now, a rejection at the level of discourse and paradigm is not the same, of course, as what happens at the level of policy implementation. Because in a closed African conversation, the continent has a rich history of passing, swinging and far-reaching declarations, which basically gather dust on the shelves, because either those who led the declarations betrayed, or the domestic constituency is not built, or they blink, in the face of pressure from outside. And then the action plan has been supported also by a mineral governance framework, which basically is meant to be a guidance on benchmarking on implementation. Now, it's been criticized, the framework has been criticized for a number of weaknesses. Gender analysis is absent in many of the documents, even though the overarching thing recognizes the importance of gender. I mean, some people have criticized as an extractivist repackaging of a neo-colonial framework. I think it's a partially correct critique, because if you look at the original, the vision document itself, which initiated the rolling out of a policy framework. It was very much a pro-cyclical framework, which was seeking to optimize the possibilities of the existing model. But the evolution of the action plan and other documents has moved the policy regime of the African mining mission beyond that initial limitation. And part of that, of course, has to do with the input and pressures from civil society organizations, including trade unions and NGOs and so on. It pays very little attention to climate change issues. This is important because the climate change issue is not simply something inside the mining sector's contribution in terms of consumption, energy consumption, but also, energy minerals as part of thinking about the future from Africa's own development perspective is an important point. It's a dimension also of how I think that although in principle it recognizes the need to develop minerals important for domestic and local and regional economies, a lot of the subsequent work has not picked up that aspect, and still a lot is caught up in the export mineral dimension. The implementation at the supranational level has been dependent on donor financing. There's been inefficient engagement with civil society, although there was some from the beginning. But this it's a problem for anchoring a kind of ambitious thing like this in society. And at the very, if you're going to be hegemonic, it needs to be more widely known and embraced, by society. And implications, it does not take on board also the implications for the minerals future of pressures for building circular economies. There are some African minerals who one day say at some point the pressure for recycling and also substitutes could become an issue. Also in the production level, artificial intelligence and changes taking place in the organization of mining work, it's something that needs to be incorporated into any discussion about a new minerals and development discourse in the African continent. Because large-scale mines increasingly are automating their thing. They already were employing very few people, but increasing automation is reducing even more those who are being employed. Deep underground mines are looking to a future where human beings, don't go in there. So the expectations of what mining can contribute to employment is something which needs to engage attention. And I just have a quick comparison with the debates in South and Central America, because the critique of extractivism, of course, it picks a concept which is was developed in Latin American context, new extractivist approaches developed by people like Costa, and others. And to the extent that part of the conception was to take advantage of global trends, the expectation that FDI-led expansion is part of it, improvement in fiscal returns and sharing formula, to restore central rule for the state, and so on and so forth. It has similarities with the Latin American case, as expressed in national policies. Because in the African case, these things have been put together not at the national level, but have been synthesized in regional and Pan-African frameworks. And they are the goal of structural transformation, the absence of which is a critique made of the pink tide in Latin America. It's frontally dealt with here by the interest in linkages and transformation and structural economic transformation of the AMD. I return to the value chain that I showed you earlier, because this value chain assumes that the economic value of mineral starts from when the government awards a license what it gets from it is revenue, which revenue is then used to implement public expenditure and development. The framework that I've described as the new the emerging African discourse on minerals and development offers something like this, which takes the totality of the ways in which minerals actually feed into economy, into economic and social life. Because the thing about the raw minerals, even before you get to the extraction, I mean, there's research and development taking place. There are the junior companies who are involved in exploration and finding the minerals, who sell their finds to the big companies who exploit. There are the inputs that go into the mining sector. There are the products that come out, which can be used in different areas of the economy and so on. But if you have a raw material commodity export dependent model, what you are getting, you're focusing on basically is this side of the thing. But whereas it is possible, if you move beyond the small national economies that we have, and you take at least a regional perspective, you can see the possibilities of building economic value, job creation, income, and sustainability. If you also taking on board, of course, the need to pay attention to the other elements, whether minerals should be developed in a particular area, the externalities, the impacts, and so on, FPIC and all that. But if you do produce minerals, it is possible to conceive of a much more economic benefit than simply the revenue that you get. I mean, if we follow that logic, I mean, African countries could support the expansion of housing, for example, if they were paying more attention to the use of minerals that will support the housing industry, whether it's clay, and other areas, and inputs into agriculture and so on. So if you look at the SADC regional regional mining vision, what it does is it tries to offer a view about what minerals can contribute in a multifaceted way, to structural transformation. One of its weaknesses, however, is that to be able to get there, I mean, a number of the key issues about kind of land use choices to be made about whether certain minerals can be mined or not, and whether there are alternative uses which are better, impact management, whether impacts would be something which can be taken for granted in producing a certain mineral. If you took, it doesn't say enough about that, which for me would be an important upgrade that the SADC regional mining vision would have to undertake. But it sets out basically a view about how different mineral resources could, seen in a regional perspective, link the economies of SADC in a way that is mutually beneficial, rather than the ways in the extraversion where they are linked into the logic of international capital, and also therefore makes possible the beginning to think about the exploitation of mineral resources, which hitherto have been neglected because foreign firms are not interested, or they are not of interest to foreign markets. I go to the linkage and diversification element, which is cluster 8 of the African mining vision, because it connects with one of the new key developments in the current climate, which is local content policy. Now, the linkage and diversification thing sits within a long-term vision of structural transformation to end raw material commodity dependence, and is also consistent with the reformist project of expanding local content in the mining model as it is. Remember, I said earlier that the AMV combines reformist as well as transformative elements. So the thing about increasing fiscal revenue, definitely every mining model must have that it doesn't offer you structural transformation unless you have a conscious project of building linkages and diversification. But you will find that since the boom, the issue of building linkages, or at a lesser level, local content, has really come to the fore. So you find all these things I've listed here, from policy frameworks to specific project proposal for specific projects and national policy document, all of them talking about the need to build linkages, but some with less ambition, talking really only about local content. I mean, one of the more famous books in that regard is the book published in 2012 by Morris, Kaplinski, and Kaplan, titled "One Thing Leads to Another: Promoting Industrialization by Making the Most of the Commodity Boom in Africa." That was replicated in some sense by the 2013 UN Economic Commission Economic Report on Africa, which also picked that up. There are a couple of reports, 2013 and 2014, picked that up. So you find in a number of communities, ECOWAS has something on that. The East African Economic Community has something on that. I've spoken about the SADC mining vision. And the overlap with reformist visions, which are consistent with simply refurbishing the FDI for rent model, is exemplified by the World Bank's interest in local content. In 2012, it published a proposal on how to increase local content in West African mining. Now, the thing about local content, though, is that the concept itself assumes the preeminence of foreign capital and allowing a foothold for local capital and local capital accumulation. Okay, now you can have local content policies with one or two possibilities. You can take it either as a building block for structural transformation, in which event you have to take on board some of the kind of wider domestic and international policy and legal frameworks, which are constraints on structural transformation. I'm talking about trade and investment rules, bilateral investment treaties, and also therefore that you must have mandatory policies to do this. And to be effective, you need a kind of a regional, supranational approach. I mean, no puny African country on its own is going to be able to have much of an effect, which is where the early anti-colonial thing, where as a bloc, African countries got those resolutions passed, with the Global South got those resolutions passed in the UN, is illustrative. And how the role of UNCTAD in its early years in putting commodities at the center is illustrative of the point that I'm making. The other approach is to see it as a way of accommodating domestic capital and elite pressures. In that context, what you find that the terms of the local content policies are negotiated. They are voluntary frameworks requiring best endeavor by firms as opposed to they having to comply with public policy and law, and which is what the World Bank has been pushing. In this context also, there is less interest in who owns the enterprises which are generating the local content. Simply the value addition which is being locally generated is focused on. Now that is consistent with the notion of things should be in the market. The state should stay back and allow companies to sort things out among themselves. So the World Bank's framework that has been pushing, the West Africa framework, has found expression in the Ghana Supplies Program. The International Finance Corporation of the World Bank has a framework which has been applied in places like Zambia and a number of other places. And just to underline the point I'm making about a framework which dominant mining capital is comfortable with, is illustrated by a report that I was looking at on local content in Sierra Leone, where this report written by GIZ proudly proclaims that Sierra Leone has developed a local content policy, which is part of its competitive advantage, against other African countries, because it is something that is going to be agreed to by the companies. So really, the companies are basically giving a corner, as it were, of the domestic mineral economy to local firms and local sections of the elite as a way of restructuring the relationship for their own continued dominance. And what we found also in other contexts, that the local content policy in that it's not a guarantee of benefits for workers or local communities. In fact, within the context of outsourcing, people are looking also to build their own accumulation. And it is taken out on workers in terms of their remuneration, their working conditions, and also pulling back from some of the benefits that local communities would typically expect to get. The core mining company disclaims any responsibility because the people are not its employees. This is made worse in the global context of financial capital, where a number of studies in South Africa, Zambia, and Australia have drawn attention to the fact that the return on shareholder value, which hedge funds and other financial investors who have mopped up a lot of the capital of mining companies are interested in, it's not the long-term rebuilding of an expansion of the firm. They want a return as a financial return on their capital, as opposed to a traditional mining company which is interested in expanding its portfolio and so on. So this has been influential in how many of the big mining firms, just like other big productive capital firms, have been broken up and things have been outsourced. So in that context, local content, which is seen as building relations, in the local economy and so on, is of very little interest, to financial capital, which is somewhere is looking for return. There's an interesting study about what the collapse of Lonmin in South Africa, and what happened at Marikana, as illustrative of how that pressure was brought to bear on Lonmin when its capital was internationalized. Financial actors bought into its capital, and those things just generated a certain logic of trying to keep the investors happy, which had consequences in the labor relations and the blow up in Marikana, and eventually in the company overreaching itself and being sold for almost nothing when it's collapsed. So this local content, which has come to the fore and is seen by many as offering a way forward, I think it's important to seize limits and make clear that we must be talking about we must retain faithful to a notion of structural economic transformation, within which then the changes in how you build, local enterprise transformation and building a new economic units are located. Having said this, I mean, as I said, the AMV, it's a framework, a vision of an alternative which challenges the dominant thing, but it's nowhere near being its policy uptake has been at best patchy, and there are many pressures bearing on it. I mean, the global mineral economy is dominated by TNCs and firms from China and other places who are interested in continuing to get their return. I mean, the African and other efforts to push back and gain more value from their mineral resources has faced resistance from the companies and their home countries. In fact, at a certain moment during the commodity boom, if you picked any investment risk assessment report, whether from PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, or and so on, they put resource nationalism very high up among the things that were a threat to them. And this is connected, of course, with the fact that the big powers are interested in security and security access, security and reliability of supplies as critical issues for their economies. And we know that they've used international trade and investment, instruments to underpin this. So the wriggle room for change has to, kind of transcend, the issues around the WTO, the way the EU has put these restrictions in the economic partnership agreements with Africa, and also, of course, the obligations that countries have in existing contracts, with the companies. And the United States, through its AGUA, also has limitations. Bilateral investment treaties already limit the pressure to the country's ability to put performance requirements, on companies operating in their country, which is why a number of countries have decided to end signing bilateral investment agreements. South Africa being one of them. But the zombie clauses remain from those things. You can't abrogate them for up to about 10 years after you've given notice of getting out of them. And of course, all our countries face the seduction of aid and investment flows from investing in mineral importing powers for raw materials. I mean, the FOCAC, for example, has become a regular source of interest, for African countries because things are announced there. The last FOCAC in Dakar, the reports and analysis expressed disappointment that China is no longer putting as much money on the table as it used to. And Africa has a number of these frameworks with countries. There's one with India, there's one with Brazil, there's one with Russia, there's one with Turkey, So all these are pressure points. And in addition, particularly the Western powers are using other instruments to what I call kind of a soft instruments to put pressure. So you find, for example, that there's support for contract negotiations from the G7 to African countries. This was announced in 2014. The World Bank is developing a geological information system with EU, incorporating the EU, including an African atlas, setting up what the geological resources are. One may ask, is this to the continent's benefit or not? But it's been done in cooperation, with the African Union. But domestically also, of course, there are pressures and challenges for how far this agenda can be carried. The dependence on minerals, raw material exports for revenue and so on. But this framework, in terms of its possibilities, as I've indicated, goes beyond being a mineral policy. It takes in industrial policy, it takes in trade and investment policy, it takes in financing, policy. It raises questions about the character of the state, the class leadership of the state, and also state capacity. One of the problems that has been persistent around state capacity has been even just the technical quality to plan and to negotiate contracts. There are the domestic vested interests in the existing model. And as I've said, the Africa has a history of passing, grandiose frameworks which come to nothing, which is why having popular ownership of the transformative elements of the agenda will be critical to how it goes forward. But to date, the attention of governments have been focused very much on the parts which bring immediate benefit, particularly the fiscal component. The things which have to do with improving people's conditions. For example, the AMV has the African Money Vision has a framework, has a thing about African countries implementing, free, prior, informed consent and respecting international human rights instruments. The ECOWAS framework has the same, but not many countries have picked it up. The ILO framework 176 on health and safety in mines has been approved by only 4 or 5 African countries. So these are all indications, about the split between popular expectations and, political leadership vis-a-vis the grand framework that these things, this synthesis, as I called it, of policy at the regional and global level represents. So where the rubber hits the ground at the national level, you will find that, there are problems. But I think one thing which can be said on the positive side is that, I mean, transformation requires, first of all, a foothold for new ideas, in the context of ideas about what is acceptable. To that extent, the breach in the hegemony of this FDI for rent model, which was imposed on the continent, 30 or so years ago, is very significant. And the fact that in these frameworks adopted by governments, key demands by popular constituencies have also found expression, means that rather than continuing to bang on about the need for governments to accept the importance of recognizing these principles, the front line, in my view, has shifted from making a demand for recognition to now making a demand for implementing policy and change, which means that the coalitions to be built, the political struggles, can move on from a kind of defensive position to a combination of defensive and offensive positions. Because we know that the acceptance of these things does not mean that governments are going to stop, terrorizing mining affected, communities, or expropriating ASM people from land they've been working for a long time when a large-scale company comes into view. But in various domestic jurisdictions, people are picking up things in that way and trying to use them as a basis for contesting policy. The one of the things also in this period we can note is that there's been a growth in popular organization around these issues, of change, and that organization also has involved the building of alliances. It also, I think, has brought some of the demands in the African context closer to some of the elements that you find in the global South popular struggles around extractives, and offers the possibilities of deepening those alliances. And I think we also need to note that given the divergences which have taken place in economic terms within the global South, whilst in geostrategic terms there may be some common points in dealing with the global North, the capital exporting global South powers are becoming differentiated from African countries by and large. So China, for example, is interested in security for the capital, it's exporting. Indian capital is moving around. These are important points of contradiction, which means that the traditional alliances that used to exist in international arena can no longer be taken for granted. And given the importance of that, interstate alliances for change at the global level, there are challenges for how the African agenda goes ahead. And it also points, therefore, to the terms in which African elites should see the transformation of their relations, with global South powers, and therefore the issues they put on the table and demand, beyond simply looking to those countries as an alternative source of capital or new markets, because that basically fits into the model of commodity export dependence that historically Africa had with the colonial powers. And in terms of economic logic, countries that need raw materials will source them from where they can to build their economies, unless there's a conscious discourse, a conscious conversation about the fact that global South powers should put their policy and strategic orientations towards Africa in a different place from where the colonial powers, used to be. This, I think, will be key for the progress at the global level that will be needed, to effect some of the, kind of radical changes required around the new and emerging African discourses. But that is a big call. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a really fascinating, extensive coverage of the topic. And one wished that we had more time for you to continue. although I can see already in the chat box, there are a number of questions, which I hope Walter can summarize. But it seems to me the key issues that you raised towards the end is exactly what seems to be on the mind of many participants. And the key issues that you raised is, how do we go beyond the breaches that have been made in the hegemony to developing counter-hegemonies based on popular organization domestically and Pan-African solidarity continentally. I think that probably is a key lesson to be taken from this lecture. And I can see at least two people raising similar issues. What kind of counter-hegemonic discourse can we develop as intellectuals to make a contribution towards developing a counter-hegemony based on Pan-African solidarity and popular organizations? So, Walter, can you please summarize one or two questions for Yao to answer, because I see that we are left with about 15 minutes. Walter?
Okay, Prof, I've got you. Difficult to summarize. I'll just try to run them through quickly. So there's a question from Masego around the nexus between extractives and climate change. Where do you see sites of scholarship and civil society engagement in this debate? Most of the debates seem to be driven by Northern-based organizations from the divestment movements in the climate finance sector to the net zero campaigns. What is needed to strengthen the engagement of actors in the continent to avoid the continuation of frameworks of restraint, which we spoke about earlier? Then there are a couple of other questions in the Q&A box around issues whether nationalization was just driven by the need for national ownership or the greed of the elite sector wanting to capture the benefits away from the TNCs. Then the other question relates to the emergence of armed and violent insurgencies, particularly in Mozambique, how that is related to the mineral energy complex. And then lastly, a question around whether just transition is enough to analyze the energy sector in Africa. How can African intellectuals enter the debate and influence the narrative of transition? Those are the main questions I've picked up from the Q&A and the other one in the chat box. Thank you, Prof.
Yes, I think those are the main questions. Maybe we should allow Yao to answer or to respond to those questions, and then think of if it is possible to find another opportunity where we can have more extensive discussion. But let at the moment Dr. Graham respond to those very basic questions which have been raised, and which is what I summarized in terms of how can African intellectuals contribute towards developing a counter-hegemonic discourse, which will take into account the social and the structural transformation that you have been emphasizing towards the end of your lecture. Yao?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to everybody. And maybe I should apologize for carrying on in the way that I did. Just first about nationalization. I mean, I did make the point that, I mean, if you look at Zambia at independence had the economy was basically controlled by one company, okay? The British South African company owned Zambia through its ownership of the copper mines. So to be able to build an independent country, this is an idea about we are independent, we need to control the future of our economies. So nationalization was not driven just by control and ownership. How do minerals serve the transformation agenda? When you look at the literature on Zambia, I mean, Zambia went further and became part of founding a copper producers alliance, which tried to reinforce that to build that relationship, at the global level, so that they can ensure common benefit from the resource. And so indigenization, building skills, using revenue for national development, as opposed to going to the pockets of a foreign company. It's leaving the country, because the thing about control also, if it's properly set up, you retain a lot of the value that is generated from a wasting non-renewable resource. So this was a common concern across Africa. And I think it's important not to fall into the trap of, as it was assuming with the wisdom of hindsight, because I've given you figures about the crisis of African economies, where between 1970 and 97, commodity price losses amounted to 120% of the continent's GDP, which, according to an UNCTAD estimate, would have raised per capita GDP on the continent by 50% if it had not been lost. So it's important to situate the things about corruption. Corruption is not, corruption, if you look in that period, there are problems about corruption, there are problems about the challenges of the local enterprises that they were trying to develop and so on. But if you look at all the countries that have built domestic capacity and manufacturing, invariably, there are inefficiencies that come along. And a decision is taken that if we build these enterprises and our economy is stronger and more integrated, in the long term, is beneficial. Okay? Mistakes were made. In the Zambian case, some of the negotiation could have been better and so on. And many countries made those kinds of mistakes. But again, state capacity that I talked about, was a problem. Because we've had 30 years now of the new model, where the colonial, basically we're back to the colonial extraction model. We can look at the balance sheet and ask. The World Bank superintended the 0.6% royalty rate that Zambia gave to investors, because they were told that if you don't do this, nobody will buy your copper mines. A few years on, copper prices started going through the roof and so on. Now about climate change, the nexus between climate change and the extractives. I think there are a number of dimensions. There's the specific thing, of course, about, say, energy, minerals, fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas are specific contributors to climate change, and therefore what that means in terms of their extraction. There's a whole debate now about the threat of stranding that African countries face as far as those fossil fuel things are concerned. Because there's a related issue about, how much of the carbon budget should African countries have, given their limited contribution to the consumption, the historic consumption of the space. And thirdly, there's a question about the contribution of energy consumption in the mining sector to climate change. And then fourthly, what the African mining sector can contribute to renewable energy production in terms of the exploitation of its mineral endowments. Starting with the last one, this is an important issue, not simply in terms of global economy, but also for Africa itself. Africa, where a number of countries, take Zimbabwe, has the endowment of all the current key minerals and metals required for renewable energy production. Copper, cobalt, they're all very key. Rare earth minerals. Burundi has become a producer of rare earth minerals as part of this, going forward and so on. There's a need, if we are serious about an alternative African vision on minerals and development, to take this as an urgent challenge in how we begin to work together around this. That improves also your leverage in global arena about energy transitions, and relations and so on and so forth. The EU has just decided to add gas to the list of energy sources that will be acceptable going forward. Now that is interesting, because the pressure for the elimination of all fossil fuels is very real. But you take Africa, where gas will make a huge difference to people in terms of, even just biomass, burning related diseases and so on and so forth. So there's a differentiation there to be made. So the thing about the common but differentiated responsibility and so on, I think there's a discussion, to be had. I mean, there are particular conversations in countries like South Africa about the future of coal and so on and so forth, which I think South Africans are better placed to deal with. But we cannot have that discussion without connecting it to. So when we eliminate these fuels in our domestic energy mix, what do we replace them with? Who will finance, the replacement and so on? On the other side, there's the stranding that exports face. There's a difference we make between what you consume and your expectations about, external energy markets being available for you to sell your energy fuels and so on. So these are some of the things that I would say about the nexus, because they throw up, different things. The conflict in Mozambique is really the latest example of the conflicts which have bedeviled African mining. But I refuse to take it as part of a pathology, because it's possible in each context to analyze the specific contributing factors. And I think we ought to be interested in that analysis, because there's nothing inherent in a mineral resource that should lead to conflict. The terms on which firms are allowed into an area, the insensitivity to existing patterns of land use and livelihoods, insensitivity to consultation and consent from the communities, insensitivity about keeping people informed and part of any processes, insensitivity to benefit sharing and so on. All these things, intra-elite conflicts, all these things can lead to conflict. And I mean, Mozambique, those who are better placed can point to. But I think in each context, we can put a finger on the combustible factors which contribute to the outbreak of conflict. There's nothing inherent in mineral endowment, which leads to conflict.
Thank you. Thank you, Yao. Would you like to say anything about intellectuals' contribution towards developing a counter-hegemony?
No, I think it's very important. It's very important. I mean, if you look at the movements which have developed across our continent, the analysis done by scholars and other types of intellectuals have been very important in providing information and arming people. And it can take many forms. I mean, I'll use an ongoing example in Ghana here of the work that Third World Network has been doing around salt in Ghana. Salt doesn't usually come into the story, but salt is very important in the alternative energy discussion in some forms, and also it's a key resource for human consumption and industry. The Ghana government has given away the lagoon, which is potentially the biggest source of salt production in West Africa, to a party crony, when there's an existing framework for that to be developed for the local communities to be part of it. This 158 square kilometer lagoon has been given to one person, and suddenly 70,000 people find themselves expropriated. We have been involved in providing analysis of the terms of the agreement, working with community activists and also with a local radio station to publicize the public documents. Just last week, that radio station was attacked by thugs. Their crime being the fact that the public documents that Third World Network obtained and made available to them, which they were sharing with the local people by translating into the local language, had become such a powerful alternative analysis of what is going on, that the company's lies have been exposed. The chiefs who are in the pocket of the company are increasingly isolated. And this thing takes place at from that local level to analysis of the minerals regime, benefit sharing. So it is very critical. And then sharing across national boundaries. We work with people across Africa to produce analysis and to intervene, in policy debates, and also relations outside the African continent, both global South and global North. Some of the early work that TWM Africa did, without the input of intellectuals from countries exporting mining capital, especially Canada, our work would not have taken off with the speed that it did. So, I mean, it's a self-obvious point that, we intellectuals have a very important role, but we need to bridge the divides between scholarship and activism, not necessarily ourselves, but how we build relations with organizations and how we communicate. That two-way process, I think, is very critical.
Once again, thank you very much. Yao. Of course, all these have to be translated into our own concrete conditions, where we are and how do we begin. With those remarks, with your permission, let me once again thank Dr. Yao Graham for the extremely insightful and informative lecture. You raised many issues which we need to discuss throughout, but one important point that you raised is that many of our issues cannot be isolated, but they have to be integrated. And at the end of the day, transformation will depend on political struggles in which popular organizations are involved, and which then become a basis for developing popular discourses and conversations. Once again, let me thank you on behalf of all the participants, on behalf of the Agrarian South Network, and Walter and Freedom. You have seen in the chat box, people are requesting to share the PowerPoint presentation. And I hope that you'll also be able to put Dr. Graham's lecture on iPod or something, which will be available to people across the continent. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Graham.
Thank you, Yao. That was brilliant.
Paris, do you want to make some closing remarks?
Thank you all. Thank you to Dr. Yao Graham for this marvelous presentation. Very insightful. We have learned a lot, gotten the whole picture in a 2-hour session, and I'm sure it will inform all our discussions throughout the rest of this week. So thank you very much. All we can do is invite our friends to return tomorrow to this Zoom link and participate on our panel sessions throughout the rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Before you close it, Yao, it absolutely was fascinating, brilliant. Please do deliver your article to Agrarian South at your earliest convenience. No, what you said, we really, yes. So, and stay well. It was absolutely fascinating, fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.